Hey guys, welcome back to Proper Chuffed. My name's Hilton and I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. Welcome to a new series I'm calling Proper Mucked. For the longest time, I've been talking about all these locomotives that I've picked up and how great it would look if they were a little bit more weathered. And with my layout now under deconstruction as I make space for Done Roman version 2, I thought it would be a great time to get my hands dirty and dive into this world of weathering. Now, I come from a background of model aircraft, so I've got a fair idea of how to weather and make things a little bit more grimy. When it comes to model railways, it's a different ballgame altogether. So this is my first attempt and I'm gonna see how it goes. There are a lot of great YouTube channels focused specifically on weathering. I think of, off the top of my head, Bunter's Yard and SBJ from Emperor's Path. Both those guys are seasoned pros and really know what to do. So please do go check out those two channels unless you're already subscribed to them. They're both fantastic gents. And I particularly love SBJ's stuff. He's got such a good sense of humor and I'm really enjoying the Model Rail Replacement podcast that him and James from the Western Signalman have put together. In fact, while I put this entire video together, I was listening to that podcast and there's no better way to pass that time. Weathering is a daunting thing to do and I won't lie, I had a fair bit of trepidation before I got into this. But what I decided to do was take one of my older models, in fact a non-runner, and weather that up first as a test to see if I could do it first of all, and to show you that even an idiot like me can make this work. So I'm going to take you through my process step by step and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. The subject of today's video is a Class 42 Warship, and interestingly enough, a couple days ago I put out a post on my YouTube community feed about which GWR loco I should get first because I actually don't have one. And in many ways, this is technically my first GWR loco and it's actually one of my oldest. I've had it for quite some time now and it's appeared here and there in a couple videos in a siding or something. But it is a non-runner, so it's a perfect time for me to actually get down, get it all grimy and greasy. I've got an example of what I'm kind of aiming for, and I'll show you how I sort of bring that idea to life. So without further ado, let's dive into it and get proper mucked. That's so cheesy. Anyways, let's go. Right, so here's our warship, Foxhound. I actually picked this up because if you know Foxhound, or you know video games, Foxhound is the name of one of the major organizations in Metal Gear Solid, and I'm a huge Metal Gear fan. So when I saw the name and the warship, I couldn't help but pick it up. Anyways, as you can see, it's picked up a bit of dust, so I'm just gonna dust it all off and clean it up before we get to any of the severe weathering that we're going to do today. So here we go with our first attempt, and I figured, you know what, if 00 Dave can do it, I can do it too. Just kidding, Dave. I think your weathering work is absolutely amazing. Keep it up, mate. So one of the first steps is going to be to cover the glass windows, or plastic windows as they are. I use Mr. Hobby, Mr. Masking Sol. For those of you familiar with something like Humbrol's Maskol, this is exactly the same thing, and you can just apply this directly to the windows without fear of damaging the loco at all. It's going to cover it in a sort of rubbery resin to protect any parts that you want to remain unweathered. So this is fantastic for just coating across the windows. And I'm doing the wipers too. It's okay if there's a bit of overspill on anything because it just makes it look a little bit more authentic too. I'm also not going to clean up the engine windows as I feel like those would probably not be cleaned on a day-to-day basis, whereas the driver's windows would be. So I'm going to leave those to get nice and weathered too. Next up, I'm going to use the Tamiya Panel Line Accent Color. Now this is a fantastic little product from Tamiya, and you can apply this before or afterwards, but I like to do it before just to touch bases. And I'm basically just going to run along any of the panel lines that I feel like need to be accentuated a little bit. And we're just going to touch it along the major panel line. So here where the diesel tanks are, I'm just kind of putting all that detail in. This is fantastic stuff because you just touch it along the panel lines and it just runs along them very smoothly on its own. A very freely flowing liquid that kind of does the job for you, so you don't really need to paint those lines in, so to speak. And I'm just going to touch along the vents just to make sure they're all nice and dirty and grimy there too. And as you can see, it just runs smoothly into those grooves without any trouble.
It's an incredibly satisfying thing to work with because it just really does the job for you. It's okay if there's a bit of overspill here and there because it all just sort of adds to the overall weathering effect. You don't have to be too precious about this. I'm also going to touch this into the door panels and any of the areas that I feel like grime and dust would have built up in over time. It just adds to that used feeling of all these parts that would essentially move, open, close and pick up grime over time. Next up, I'm going to use a Humbrol rust wash on certain parts of the locomotive, particularly the bogies and wheel sets. This is fantastic stuff. I've used this before on model aircraft. We don't actually get Humbrols in South Africa anymore for some reason. I think it's a Hornby distribution issue. So what I've got left is really the last of my reserves. But as you can see, I've got a fairly full pot. And what I'm going to do here is just really touch on all the mechanical parts of the locomotive, essentially the bogies, make them really grimy and rusty. We're going for a really used and abused look here. So you can go kind of crazy and just really smear it all on and make it all build up. It almost creates its own sort of sets of layers because the more you apply to a certain area, the darker it'll get. And once it dries, you've got sort of variations in color of rust. I'm not too worried about protecting the pickups here because if I wanted to get this locomotive running again, I would essentially need to open it up and clean everything out anyways. So I'm just going to go ham here and totally drench these bogies in the rust wash. Next up, I'm going to be using Tamiya Weathering Master. This is a fantastic product from Tamiya. It's essentially like makeup, but for modeling. And as you'll see, you get a small palette of colors. There are different sets available, and the one I've picked up is probably one of the most versatile. That includes a snow white, a soot black, and a rust brown. And I'm going to start off by using the rust brown. It comes with this small little applicator, which is essentially like a little makeup brush, and you can just scrape it. It's quite a sort of clayish texture, and it sticks to surfaces very quickly and very easily. I'm just going to start applying this to the lower section where the diesel tanks are to kind of build up that rust effect. As you can see, I'm being pretty cautious here, but I'm going to slowly start building that up as I feel a little bit more comfortable with the application itself. Now the little applicator has two sides to it, obviously the one sort of makeup side and then a small brush, and you can use that brush to sort of even things out and dust down a little bit if you feel like you've applied too severely, or you can just use your finger. That's a fantastic option too. But don't be like me and rather use a glove when you do that. So we're just going to keep adding to that rust layer in the lower section and build it up onto the sides of the locomotive, on the body a little bit more, as well as around the cab area, and just start allowing that rust to sort of creep up a little bit more. So I'm pretty happy with how this is looking now, but I'm going to use a bit more of that Humble Rust Wash to kind of build up a bit more streak work on the sides and the body of the locomotive, just to add a little bit more detail and a diversity in color. Next up, we're going to use the soot color from the Tamiya Weathering Master set, and we're going to build this up onto the top of the locomotive where the exhausts and all the sort of dirt and grime from the diesel fumes would be. This didn't come out quite as I wanted it to. I was hoping for a slightly darker and deeper variation in color from the original base color of the locomotive, but it's nice to apply these layers there. You will see it at the end of the day, that sort of variation in color, although it is fairly subtle. I'm also going to start applying this to the upper quarter of the locomotive, as well as the vents and grills, and start creating a bit of a streak effect, as if that dirt and diesel exhaust has sort of been washed down over time under rain and different weathering effects. I don't think there's any hard and fast rule here. You kind of work out exactly where the outlets for the exhaust and, engine works are, and you can kind of start building those up over time. I'm no Warship expert, but I'm kind of guessing this is where most of the stuff was, and looking at the reference photo, I can kind of see where the grime is sort of seeping down from mostly. Finally, I'm going to use the white or snow effect on the Tamiya Weathering Master kit, and this essentially creates the illusion of oxidized water or dried up water that has sort of come from perhaps the boiler of the locomotive and has sort of dried up and oxidized on the sides of the locomotive. And it just creates a slight different variation in color as opposed to the brown and black that we've been going for previously. It just creates a really nice variance in the weathering of the locomotive to add these sort of small white streaks. I'm not going to go absolutely crazy with this, but it's small, subtle, and it does the job, I think. Right, now we get to the really fun stuff, and this is my airbrush. It's a very basic airbrush kit that I picked up for about 80 pounds or so. It's a very small little compressor, I think designed essentially for makeup application, but frankly I don't see myself needing more right now. The brush itself is a top fill gravity fed airbrush, and I make sure to clean it thoroughly before and after use always. To create the daily dirt and grime that I want on the side of the locomotive, I'm going to be using a range of Vallejo colors. These are pre-mixed and ready to drop straight into your airbrush. You can thin them down if you want to, but I use a couple of drops of each of these colors. One is a very sort of light yellow sandy color, and the other is a slightly darker brown sort of burnt umber color. I'm mixing these two colors together and then adding a little bit of thinner just so that we're not too heavy on the paint front. And then I just use a pipette to sort of blend all those three elements together to create a nice liquid mix.
It goes without saying, if you are using an airbrush, it's important to be in a well-ventilated room or to use an extractor fan of some sort. Otherwise, make sure you use a face mask. There are microparticles that can be harmful, so make sure you mask up before you get to it. Anyways, let's do this.
Just going to test that the airbrush is working correctly and firing on all cylinders, and without further ado, we'll get straight into it. Let's get going with some fun airbrushing. Now, I do apologize here. I do realize that me putting my hand in front of everything kind of makes everything go out of focus, and my camera is doing its very best to keep up with where the focus should be. I will improve this in future videos. It's not going to be a problem for much longer. So I'm just going to go along the lower half of the locomotive and just make sure this is nice and grimy and really start building that up. And what's fantastic is that with the Tamiya weathering colors that I've put on previously, now adding the airbrush, it looks like those layers have been built up over time. Each layer of weathering is telling a different story of where the locomotive's been, what it's been through, and it's just fantastic to build these layers up and get that story and bring it to life. It makes you really wonder what this locomotive's done in its life. Right, so I'm pretty happy with that, but now it's time to turn our attention to some darker colors using the airbrush. So to create our dark exhaust effect, we're going to use Tamiya X19 smoke, and also what I didn't show was the Tamiya sort of straight black. I do a blend of those two together to create a slightly darker effect, as the smoke by itself is a little bit light and is almost invisible in many regards. So adding a little bit of black to that to create a darker effect, and we're just going to go over all the exhaust vents on the locomotive to start adding that darker diesel exhaust effect. So you can see it's quite glossy right now, and that's the black and smoke working together to create quite a shiny surface. But we're going to turn that down a little bit later, so no stress on that right now. So I want this locomotive to look quite used, and based on the original image that I'm working from, I'm going to try and build up some oil along the bottom of the locomotive, particularly around the diesel tanks down here. This works a lot like the accent liner, and you can essentially just dab it down and it'll start running into those areas. But I'm going to paint it on to add an effect of a bit more of a leaky tank situation, so it looks really grimy and dirty down here. I'm going to add it into all the recesses where I think that oil and diesel would build up over time. So that includes this small little port here. You can also add this to the bogies themselves just to create a bit more of an oil effect along the springs and major working components where oiling would be necessary most times. I'm also going to add this oil wash to the buffers themselves to create the effect of buffer grease. It's probably a little bit too light. You could probably add a bit of black here just to darken it and give it a bit more of an effect. But for now, that's what I'm working with. Right, so I'm happy with how things are looking now, and I think it's time to varnish this loco up. I have obviously not done this all in one go. I've given the locomotive time to dry, and that usually takes about 12 hours or so. So we're going to varnish it with Vallejo matte acrylic varnish, and in order to get a decent milky mix for the airbrush, I'm going to use about 3 parts acrylic varnish to 1 part thinner and mix it all up together, just so that we got a nice smooth liquid to apply to the locomotive. Now you're not really going to see the application of the varnish here because it's a see-through liquid, but we're going to cover the entire locomotive and you'll see it'll really tone down those shiny edges that we had previously. And we're pretty much done now, but I think what I'm going to do is use a little bit of IPA, or isopropyl alcohol, and clean up the nameplate Foxhound. Because in my world, my driver is very, very proud of his Warship, and I am too. So let's clean up these logos, the BR emblem too, make sure they're nice and glossy, because that's one element that this driver particularly takes care of. I'm also just going to add a bit of IPA to the sides of the body here to create some different streaks on the loco, just to give it a bit more of an effect. And finally, we will remove the Mr. Mask Sole from Mr. Hobby on the sides of the windows, and I use a little craft knife to just grab an edge and peel it back, and as you can see, it looks crispy and clean. With that, we're pretty much done, and I'm happy with this as an overall first attempt. Let's move on to the Glamour Shots.
Stepping away from it and looking at it again, I think there are a couple things I would change, perhaps to be a little bit more heavy-handed on the sort of soot, diesel grime on the sides of the vents, and perhaps go a little bit heavier on the sides too. It does seem a little bit tame, so perhaps on my next project I might try something even grimier. There will be a fair bit of content coming out around weathering in the next couple weeks as I sort of am working on the layout and doing all that recording too. So I find that the weathering stuff is a great sort of break in the kind of content I've been putting out for the past couple months, and it really is enjoyable, and I'm having a good time doing it. So let me know if you enjoyed. If you want to see more, that would be awesome, because you're probably going to see more. But again, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed this, drop me a thumbs up. That would be really great. And until I see you next time, keep your engines fired and stay on track. All the best.